Hi, Misha here. And yeah, this is a black box that I pretty much knew I was going to have to make, and enough have asked me to do. But I'm not sure how helpful I'll be, and I'm not sure you'll agree with what I'm going to say. But therein lies me just giving my honest assessment and opinion. So, yeah, let's talk about the situation with Russia, Ukraine, and Putin. But first, a little bit of channel news to start off on a lighter note. So as you know, on the main Mishaco channel, took a bit of a vacation or rest in February, and that helped a lot. There's some new gun stuff in. I've talked about it a bit on the Patreon page. We'll be doing the Hellion, I still hate that name, I think VS or VHSA or something. Anyway, personal taste. Be talking about that because it's one of the few actual new things, and it's not like we're just flush with tons of bullpups right now. Well, I guess the last new one we got was nearly a decade ago with the Tavor, unless you want to count the X95 or some of the stuff that maybe Keltec has done. Anywho, got that done. We'll see how that goes. Yeah, got a few neat new things as far as historical guns to talk about. Just put out another video on the Swiss stuff. Be picking up the newest batch from those and marketing those soon. Pretty old hat, but not in a bad way. And the gun community is doing what gun community things do. Not a whole lot there to talk about. As far as models, not really a lot new to talk about there either. It seems like we had a little bit of a jump at the end of January with new stuff coming in, and now it's been pretty quiet again. It also, the fact of the matter is, there's not a lot of stuff announced coming out that I'm all that interested in. A lot of it's just a repaint or a minor variant on what I already have. Plus the cost. It's getting, I'm not saying no. If something super neat and new comes around, yeah, I'll buy it. But the cost now is getting to the point you just can't do that willy-nilly. You gotta really want something. So that's unfortunate. But I still have a number of Hobby Masters, even a few Corgis on order, and I hope they all come in. A bit ironic, I've been doing, the armor videos. I picked back up with the Russian armor for obvious reasons, but a lot of the most recent ones I picked up came in December and January. I was getting them directly out of Russia, but then eBay made it difficult for the sellers in Russia for different reasons that really don't have anything to do with anything except for payment and stuff. So then I started buying them out of Ukraine, and well, yeah. So my last package came in at the very end of January, beginning of February. They're inexpensive little models, but they're not available here in the USA, and you can't just order one at a time unless you want to get ass raped on the shipping. So you really have to kind of wait till you have 5 or 6 you want, even at $10 a pop, and then pay shipping and roll it that way. I wish more were imported, and once in a while you'll see them here, but they're pretty hit or miss. And I only do 172 scale, not 143. And there's still more Eagle Moss stuff. Not everyone's favorite cup of tea, but you know why I like it. It's relaxing. Sometimes it's nice to not have to worry about the real world and just have some fun. But yeah, like I told you during the last black box with their kind of screw up, finally got that more or less resolved. I think, I hope. We'll find out. Alright, let's talk about it. What can I say about the situation that hasn't been said ad nauseum already? I'm really not sure, and I don't know the future. And the thing is, I'm more a historian than an analyst. I don't like making predictions for the future. that's fine and not impossible to do if you know all the factors. Unfortunately, there's unknown factors and wild card events that pop up, and the last 2 years have sure as shit taught us that. So with that being the wild card, it's like trying to estimate something with only half the data. It's what's the point? I mean, it's good to analyze what's going on at the moment, but to have long-term speculation, I just don't. I'm more of a historical person that analyzes the past to try to elucidate what's going on in the present. All that said, what's happening is wrong. And what Putin is doing is foolish, and it's about as immoral as you can really get at, objectively immoral. After all, Europe has very deep scars going back to World War I and World War II. And outside of the breakup of Yugoslavia and similar Civil War type events, this is the first true full-scale invasion and war between two sovereign nations on categorically European soil since that time. It's an unprecedented event. And there's no justification. And if it was executed properly, you could say one thing, but even there, it wasn't. The question is, why is this happening? What's the idea? What's the plan? Is there one? And what's the outcome? Where can this lead? Well, that's what we've been debating around my house for the last 5 days. And now, please keep in mind, I'm recording this. As soon as I do, even now as I'm recording, it's out of date because events are happening at such a rate. So things will have happened already when you listen to this that I don't know about. And even things that happened in the past, I've done my best to keep up. But, you can't listen to everything. That said, I'm going on American news sources, the BBC, and yes, Russian news sources as well. So, yeah. But first, let's go back to the period I grew up in and the period that Putin became an adult and started his career with. I'm talking, of course, about the kind of second half of the Cold War. I would be classed as part of Generation X, so sandwiched right in between what's known as the baby boomer generation, that was once said without any irony or derision, and the millennials, which should not be taken with derision because, well, kind of face facts. They're 30 years old these days. But anyway, that's where I was sandwiched in between, which also means I grew up during the latter stages of the Cold War. Now, the generation before me grew up in the time when nuclear exchange was a very real possibility. I think in history we can agree that 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, was the absolute closest we've come to that. And that's because both sides had legitimate grievances and both sides had a legitimate case, but one side had to back down. Luckily, Khrushchev and Kennedy both recognized that, you know what, wiping out the human race was not going to serve communism or capitalism. There's a better way. There's basically, this is just not an option. And to his credit, Khrushchev backed down, although there were plenty of under-the-table concessions given by the Kennedy administration too. Diplomacy won out, and since that time, channels of communication between Washington and Moscow were made available, where that would hopefully never happen again. Of course, in some ways this would ultimately lead to Khrushchev's toppling in the Soviet Union, but luckily for him, unlike previous Russian leaders throughout history, he was actually allowed to retire to a dacha and enjoy being a grandfather. Because while he wasn't perfect, while he made blunders, while he was a communist and did some things and took part in purges, he wasn't bloodthirsty. Compared to Stalin and Beria that came before him, he was a practical saint. And the same can be said about Kennedy. He had faults and whatnot, but the thing you can say about him, he learned from his mistakes, including the Bay of Pigs. I don't believe in passing the buck. Even if the Bay of Pigs thing got started under Eisenhower, Kennedy could have stopped it. He did not. So it happened on his watch. Things cooled off in the 70s a bit. I'm gonna give credit to The Spy Who Loved Me from James Bond and his version of détente. In other words, railing a Russian to cool things off. But you had a time where there was enough turmoil in America, focusing on other areas. Nixon, Carter, and Brezhnev, especially at that point, was not a hawk as such, an old timer, but not a hawk. It's also worth pointing out that around 1968, 1970, the Soviet average citizen pretty much enjoyed the best life they ever had. In fact, considering how much of Russia was agrarian and even peasant before the Bolsheviks, for a majority of Russians, the standard of living was about as high as it ever got. And then the 80s, things got a little rockier. After Brezhnev's passing, there was a succession of leaders that destabilized things. Tensions did rise a bit for various geopolitical reasons. And we had Ronald Reagan that pretty much hit it on the nose and kind of forced another type of confrontation. But the nice thing about Reagan, he wasn't an absolute hardliner that would never negotiate, that would never compromise. He'd make a point and then accept the other side if they, met him halfway. Which is why you started to see a thaw beginning around 86, 87. And of course that would progress on to the falling of the Berlin Wall in 89. But growing up in that time, we had an interesting attitude towards Russia. There was respect, but there still was lingering fear, as evidenced by movies like Red Dawn. And there still was times of doubt and uncertainty. We knew that halfway around the world, there was an ideology and a form of government that was, at least in theory, diametrically opposed to what the West had. And I remember it talking with my parents, namely my father, because he was more into politics. My mother never has had much truck for that. And asking what it was like, and what I was trying to comprehend what it was like not to be free, what that meant. And some of what he told me was really quite true, and some was a little hyperbolic. For example, I asked if you were free to marry who you wanted or choose your career. Well, you were free to marry who you wanted in Russia, unless you were part of the genetics programs earlier on. Ivan Drago. I'm only halfway kidding. And as far as careers, that was a little more determined for you, but more based on aptitude and or who you knew and where you could get in. Now, sometimes if you were born a farmer, you were kind of kept there on the commune. But it was always of interest, at least to me. Then again, I was always kind of a fan of the baddies, the bad guys, and playing with my action figures, my G.I. Joes, Star Wars toys. It always did intrigue me, and kind of took note. And I remember watching on television the events of 1989 and 1991 with great interest. And then that post-Cold War era of the 90s with Clinton as president, it was a different, it was a very optimistic time by and large to be an American. We kind of had a lot of our confidence restored by the first Gulf War. The economy was doing well. 9/11 had not happened yet, and we thought we won the Cold War. Now, there were plenty of problems, we know this, but perception, I'm going to be honest, it was a pretty darn good time to be a young person. Things had kind of loosened up. Gas prices were low, you could go places. Computers were starting to get into homes. And we did invent the internet, although we weren't really sure what to do with it yet. Sometimes I think the internet was actually better back then, to be honest with you. In Russia, though, the 90s were a different situation. The Soviet Union knew it was failing, and there was a lot of events between August and December of 1991 as Gorbachev led into Yeltsin. And one of their concerns when they knew they were going down, they did not want NATO to come in and sweep across Eastern Europe and come up on their borders. And one of the major sticking points was Germany. It was clear East and West Germany were going to unify, and West Germany had been part of NATO. But they wanted for an independent, neutral Germany. And for a time that seemed, well, it was on the table, but it was always a sticking point. Was West Germany going to jump out of NATO? And East Germany needed a lot of help, and that's the problem. Once these Soviet regimes collapsed, these countries were not in good shape at all. They wanted all the alliance and help they could get. And I can't help but think especially of Poland. You know, the area of Poland has been kind of the crossroads and also trampled over throughout history. The nation was formed, at least the modern nation, after World War I, after the breakup of the Habsburgs and the dynasties there and the Ottoman Empire and all that. We had Poland. But they only had about 2 decades of independence before not only the Nazis came in, but the Russians came in. Some forget that fact, that the country was carved up like a fucking turkey, and while the Nazis were booted out, the Russians, the Soviets, the Bolsheviks never were. They had no interest in falling under Russian dominance again, hence why they applied and got into NATO. Same could be said for Hungary and the new Czech Republic, formed from, of course, Czechoslovakia. Other nations like Finland kept their neutrality, although they did start to move closer to NATO. And it has to be said that in 91, Ukraine voted to leave the Soviet Union over 90%, as did many other republics that had been under the USSR but weren't, strictly speaking, Russia. But Ukraine was a little interesting because the eastern part of Ukraine was traditionally Russian or Slavic, but the western part of Ukraine was more European and was really territory kind of annexed much later on. But they did clearly vote themselves out. It was a huge mess, and economically things were very, very dire. Kind of peaking around 98-ish time. And yeah, they wanted these nations to remain neutral as a buffer, but they didn't have much to offer them. Meanwhile, joining NATO seemed like a very good way to ensure success and cooperation with the West. This was what was desired by and large. But interestingly, not so much with Ukraine. Ukraine has always been divided between East and West. The East wants to be more aligned with Russia, and the West was more wanting to align with Europe. And that kind of kept them in a neutral place. They would oscillate back and forth a bit over the last 3 decades. but keeping them more or less neutral. And then we, of course, ended up with President Putin, who came in 2000. And the first time I went to Russia was 2004. Now, the Russian president was only supposed to serve 2 terms, 8 years, just as in America and other nations. So in 2004, Putin was still coming in from his first to second term and still absolutely not overstaying his welcome. Now, of course, his background was coming up the ranks of the KGB and having one of the better posts in Eastern Germany. And he came in. Now, keep in mind, too, that he was Yeltsin's kind of picked successor, at least for the most part. So he wasn't like he was coming up and all that. And throughout his reign, especially moving up until 2008, when it was still legitimate, he got started with the Second Chechen War. And then, of course, in 2008 was Georgia. Not exactly Snow White there as far as the purity. But his policies did improve Russia's economic situation immensely. And he put funding back into the military, which actually was really good, not just for Russia, but the world to some extent, because ever seen Lord of War, the movie? That's not untrue. Because there was so little money, so little pay, Russian armament was just going out the back door left and right. Hey, if you start paying your people and giving them some pride back, that really cuts down on that. So that was good. And relations with the USA were still pretty good, but they already by late 2004 they started to get a little rockier, and this only got worse up through 2008 and beyond. And that's when Putin pulled his first major political trick of leaving the presidency but not really leaving and then coming back. Look, he was never meant to be in there 22 years according to the Constitution. That's a flagrant violation. But that's a Russian issue, and what he was doing was working. But here's the thing. He was helping the Russian economy. But while things were getting better, the average people were not enjoying their fraction of the wealth like they should have been. Make no mistake, when the lives of the average Russian citizen got better, it's only because they were feeding off the crumbs from the table that Putin and his oligarchs were eating at. They took the lion's share of the wealth. And in fact, Putin did it so much that it became really impossible to separate Putin's private, personal wealth from just Russia's state treasury, to the point he essentially owned the fucking country. To the point he's basically the richest man in the world. Or at least he was. But with that level of success, you have problems. The first Chechen War in 94, 96 didn't go great. The second one went better for Russia and Georgia. And then, of course, we had the first thing in Crimea in 2014. The world was not happy, but because of both the political situation within Ukraine and around the world, he got what he wanted. And then he intervened in Syria. Now, to be fair, so did the West. But it was kind of a tug of war between the willpower of this. And all at the same time, he's been investing in military spending and being able to test out his new toys in these different regions. And this is where things go awry. Now, in 2016, I'm absolutely not going to get into the fact if Putin helped Trump get elected, if he did anything or not, cyber stuff, yada, yada, yada. Because I honestly don't know, and it's kind of a moot point. The fact is, Trump was very much an ally of Putin. In fact, I think it's safe to say that Trump admires Putin, is even maybe a little enamored with him. And to be fair, he can be a charismatic guy, Putin, that is, when he wants to be. He is not dumb, and he has real-world experience, and he was seemingly really doing well for his country. But again, it was almost as if Russia doing better was just dividends for Putin getting what he wanted. But throughout the 2017 to 2021, the beginning, during Trump's presidency, the USA definitely more closely sided with Russia than it had before, and definitely kind of, I don't want to say went against Europe, but there was definitely a cozy relationship there, for better or worse. And to be fair, 20 years ago when I did dissertations in college, I actually was a proponent of a closer tie between Russia and the USA, because I saw it as a good way to check China's growing power. And I don't exactly stand wrong at that, but when the Biden administration took over, the relationship between Biden and Putin was not near as cordial. Of course, we are looking at two old Cold Warriors who kind of grew up in a time. Yeah, Trump's of the same age, but he wasn't involved in politics in the 70s, 80s, and 90s like Putin and Biden were. So they knew each other. And I do think there was a certain level of respect. Now, I don't want to get into this kind of debate, but I can tell you that in Russian media, in Russian news, in Russian kind of satirical cartoons, over there, Trump was a joke. I'm just saying that was their perception. Their perception was that Putin had Trump wrapped around his little finger. Now, of course, political cartoons are a long-standing part of politics. Ask John Adams. But this is just the perception of Trump. I'm not saying the perception of Biden is any better. It's just different. Whereas Trump was seen as kind of enamored and in love with Putin in their comic strips, Biden is seen as kind of a doddering old man who's weak. Which is better, which is worse? The fact is, the last several American leaders are not portrayed in a very positive light in Russian media. And the problem with that is, by and large, and increasingly so over the years, Russian media is controlled by and is essentially a mouthpiece for Putin. And I think coming into 2022, this might be something people have maybe temporarily lost sight of. The Soviets and the KGB were masters of and greatly relied on propaganda. And that's what we're seeing here with what's being said and justifications given. Now, Russia makes a point of saying weeks ago they offered talks and compromise and talk about the growing influence of NATO. This is not wrong. It is an objective fact that NATO has expanded eastward. But it has not done so via conquest. In the 90s, it did so by being a beacon of stability for nations like Poland. And when Russia was talking, when you negotiate, you can put legitimate things on the table. Or you can put legitimate things on the table and then one thing that you know the other side will not agree with no matter what. And when negotiations don't work, you can point to that going, look, we tried to negotiate, the other side wouldn't budge. Oh well. For China, this would be Taiwan. China could come up to America and want to negotiate, and part of that would be, let us take back Taiwan. That is a sticking point that the West has not been willing to compromise on. Well, for the situation here, the sticking point was, 3 weeks ago, they wanted NATO to return to its pre-1997 borders. In other words, abdicating membership for Poland, Hungary, and many, many others, they knew this was not possible. There's no way that NATO could abandon half a dozen members. This would not work for oh so many reasons. And even if some miracle it did, talk about a sign of weakness, it would be the end of NATO. They knew that these would not go anywhere. They were not negotiations. They were not compromises made in good faith. And I'm sure people see that. What's happening now, and I'm sure by the time this video goes up, it'll still be happening, but even if NATO was expanding, launching a full-fledged war, a full-fledged invasion on a neutral third party is not the answer. I don't care what historical things might be used as justification. In Europe, everyone owned some piece of land in the past that they can reach back to. Hell, that was Saddam Hussein's inspiration for invading Kuwait in 1990, because that land once belonged to Iraq. And if you want to use the NATO thing, you negotiate for it. But outright warfare for a nation that wasn't doing anything. There were no Ukrainian terrorists attacking Russia. And the claims of not just fascists, but Nazis in Ukraine is the reason for going in. I hope everyone understands how ludicrous that is, especially for the East. The Eastern Ukrainians historically fought the Nazis tooth and nail. If there were any Nazi sympathizers 80 fucking years ago, they were in the West. But we're talking about grandparents and great-grandparents and even great-great-grandparents of people living today. And the funnier thing, too, when that didn't seem to be sticking, Putin claimed that they were druggists, that these were people hopped up on drugs fighting. Dude, people on drugs don't fight. They either pass out or they get the munchies. That's not how that works. Again, there's no justification, and it's clear because even the Russian troops were originally sent there on training exercises. You can read all this or watch all this. I would advise you, though, anything you see online, you have to fact check it. You have to make sure it's legitimate, because there have been fake videos purporting both sides on this. So just don't take everything you see and hear at face value if you're going to do this, because, yeah, it's all just saber rattling. It's all just justifications for what's a deplorable act. And it's an insane act, too. And this is something that might be difficult to convey, but I'll try. Russia, Ukraine. Russians, Ukrainians. What's the difference? Ukraine, the lands of, have been part of Russia, the Soviet Union. There hardly is any. Most Russians have some Ukrainian blood. Most Ukrainians have some Russian blood. Almost everyone on both sides has that Ukrainian or Russian grandmother or cousin or spouse. It would be as if, I was going to say the U.S. invaded Canada, but it would be more like as if England decided to invade, I don't know, Wales. It's hard to even, you're fighting your own people. It's virtually a civil war. Now, psychologically, pride. When Russia lost Ukraine 30 years ago, it was a massive, emotional, visceral blow. To lose part of their history, part of what they considered part of their lands. But you know what? The people voted to do it in Ukraine, and it happened. Now, if it happened yesterday, okay, it's one thing. It happened 30 years ago. It happened before most all of the soldiers there on both sides were even born. Keep in mind, soldiers are usually, 18 to 22 years old. Russians grew up at a time when Ukraine was not part of Russia, and Ukrainians grew up at a time when Ukraine was not part of Russia. It is wholly illogical. It is essentially, a civil war. And, Russia is a big country physically, but it only has 140 million people. Ukraine is not a tiny country, and it has 45 million people. Yeah, Russia has a bigger military budget, all of that stuff. But we're not talking about invading a small island or a nation of a couple of million. This is not something that can happen without some level of consent. And that's, I think, what's shocking everyone. Before this, Ukraine was pretty well divided. Some wanted to go with Russia, some wanted to go with Europe, some wanted just to remain in the middle and neutral, continuing to do their own thing. But once this happened out of nowhere, the thing is, whatever NATO did, whatever you might think the US did, or whatever you think Germany did, or France, or the UK, Ukraine didn't do it. And people see this. How can they not? It is just crazy. It really is. Putin, someone that I would think up until now was clever, has made a gross blunder. And maybe it's because he's been so successful over the years, especially with Crimea. Maybe it's just because he's been in power for 22 years and he's lost complete perspective. He's surrounded by yes men. And as long as they get their money, it doesn't really matter. But this is just wrong. Even on a military standpoint, it doesn't really make sense. If he were to send paratroopers in, capture key areas, and then negotiate, or if it had been a limited invasion of the breakaway, so-called independent regions, that could have been negotiated much like Crimea. It would not be good, but it would have been negotiable. But to do what's happening here, to have a full-scale invasion, land, air, and sea, you're getting away from your special forces, which will pretty much obey regardless, and you're using the average rank and file. A massive chunk of Russia's military is there. But how dedicated are they really? I mean, how many of them are partially Ukrainian themselves, or dating a Ukrainian, or married to one? How many of them just don't want to kill people? And Putin has done something here that, if not impossible, would have been pretty much a dream just a few weeks ago. He's created a unified Ukraine. Because again, Ukraine, how to explain Ukrainians? They're really fun people, in a way. They also have really good food. But they're also very passionate and very much given to their emotions and argumentative in sometimes and fickle in some ways, just like everyone. That's why there were different camps and different ways of thinking, and that's why you've had so much governmental instability there, and at times the government has been a laughingstock, and at times it's been rough, and at times they've thought about getting closer with Russia or NATO to get support. But the thing about passionate people, you've given them a banner to unify under, and by golly, they've taken it. And a very untested president there has really shown a certain mettle, a certain fortitude. I don't know how this will end. I don't know what he'll end up doing, but so far, he has shown true leadership, true courage. No, don't get me wrong, it's optics. He's an actor. He knows what he's doing. Just as Reagan was an actor and knew what he's doing. But my God, it looks good. And my God, it seems to be sincere. And that's what you're seeing. If things continue, he will be their George Washington. And on top of that, we're already seeing a mythos growing. Think about all the heroes of the American Revolution. We're seeing similar heroes there. Heck, there was even a Ukrainian version of the Alamo with those 13. We're seeing a mythos. We're seeing what can weld a nation together to become stronger. We're seeing a true identity form, not European, not Slavic, not Russian, Ukrainian. And that would be amazing and great if it wasn't at this cost. And that's where I can easily say this is categorically wrong. If it were just soldiers dying, well, I hate to say it, that's their job. It's not desirable, but it's their job. But when civilians die, that's not good. Now you could say, well, some of them are taking up arms. Yes, that's true. But when soldiers are literally coming into their city, down their streets, even into their homes, what do you expect people to do? This is what Americans often talk about they would do. They would take up arms and fight an invasion. Well, this is it. This is them actually doing what a lot of people say they would do. So don't blame them for that. And also the children that are dying or getting hurt, they're not taking up arms. That's the thing about war. I'm not going to say the Putin administration is or isn't targeting indiscriminately just everything, because in war, when you start firing shells and missiles, innocents will get hurt, innocents will die. And even if it's just young Russian soldiers and young Ukrainian soldiers, what are they dying for? What did they do wrong as individuals? I hope nothing, because I know Russians. I lived there. I know Ukrainians. I visited there. I knew a lot in university. I have to think that they're not bloodthirsty murderers of their own kind, especially, or of men, women, and children indiscriminately. The ones I knew, the ones I know today, are good people. And it's not right. Every death, every injury that happens is not right. And it is for no purpose. There's no goal. There's no end game here. It sickens me. It distresses me in a way that is hard to put into words. I don't know. I care about Russia. I care about Ukraine. I was happy Russia was doing better. It really was for the last few years. I know what Putin is. But in one swoop, he has virtually erased all the economic gains and all the international gains. It's funny to me that the whole Nord Stream 2 pipeline that Biden was against, but, it went forward. I was in favor of that. It should go forward. That was between Russia and Germany. Yes, it kind of screwed over Ukraine, but so be it. It's funny how that was one of the first things that got torpedoed. After fighting so hard for that, working with Switzerland to make it happen and all that stuff, poof, gone. The very thing that people were worried about Biden sticking his nose in, Putin destroyed in a heartbeat. And at the same time, he didn't just weld Ukraine together. He kind of reinforced Europe and even America. NATO, he did something that's very hard to do, to get Germany and France to agree, along with Britain and Italy too. NATO has been very unified on this. And it, of course, as you know, it's amazing that even Switzerland has stepped away from being neutral. Even the Nazis couldn't really get them to do that, but somehow this has. Now, of course, America is in it, but not really taking a leading role. Being supportive, doing this and that, but this is primarily a European issue. America is a member of NATO, but it should not dominate it. And I'm perfectly happy with the position we've taken so far. Now, some might consider the response to be weak across NATO. Oh, it's just sanctions. To that I say, what the fuck else do you want them to do? Do you want them to send boots on the ground? They're sending military aid. Yeah, it's maybe a little late, but I don't think anyone quite realized this was coming, except maybe some in U.S. intelligence. You can't... Russia's not Iraq or Afghanistan. They're not like the places we've sent troops to before. If we were to get into a shooting war, even if nuclear weapons were not used, this would be an adversary that we wouldn't help. We wouldn't easily defeat. And we'd be fighting on Ukrainian soil, which only would make it even worse there. It would become the no man's land, much like France was in World War I get the feeling of powerlessness and the fact that sanctions don't seem enough, but you are kind of stuck with a position where what more can you do without sending troops or even fighter jets to enforce a no-fly zone, which would be virtually the same thing. It is a horrible situation. No one is winning. No one can win. Least of all Putin. But it has kind of solidified Europe, and it has kind of shown Ukraine which way to go, for better or worse. And the fact is, the word weakness gets thrown around, but what does it really mean? Is invading a weaker nation, a nation with a smaller military when you're bigger, is that a show of strength? Is what is being done a show of strength? No. By its very nature, this is an act of weakness on Russia's part, an act of insecurity, an act of hubris, maybe. Why do I think Putin's doing it? Assuming a logical mind at play, I think he's to that age where he's thinking about his place in the history books. There was once another Vladimir that ran into Kiev on a white horse. I think in some way he wanted to be the next one, the great reunifier. He wants to restore the Soviet Union. And after 22 years of ruling the country, maybe he feels like his time is starting to run out and he has to, up the timetable a bit. But he jumped the gun massively. And now people are dying because of it, and he's in an impossible position. Theoretically, he could withdraw troops, but what message would that send? And psychologically, he won't. At the same time, if he left there, if he takes Ukraine, even part of Ukraine, NATO, the EU even, can't let that stand. Like, this type of just naked aggression, something from the 19th century, can't stand. Otherwise, they're going to fall apart. So basically, someone is not making it out of this. Either Putin is gone one way or the other, or NATO is. They both can't. The status quo is broken. We can never go back to the world we had, the status of European security before this event. Someone's going to have to blink. And unlike in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis, when both sides had legitimate grievances and concerns and had done things legitimately wrong, this time it's pretty goddamn clear-cut. on the one hand, yeah, Russia can complain about NATO's expansion in historical events and, treaties. And, there are valid concerns there. But on the other, that doesn't fucking matter when you're bombing and shooting and destroying people's lives, people that did nothing wrong. At a certain point, you have to give weight to what matters. And there it is. You can't justify. It's like if someone, I don't know, kicked you in the shin or even beat you up and then you pull a gun out and shoot them. That's not justified. Yeah, the first act was not good. Not good. And you have every right to be upset. But the response is disproportionate. And again, it wasn't Ukraine who did it to them at all. Of course, all their claims of genocide are patently absurd and not true. Not even Russians believe that. And you're seeing that in Russia today too, with the protests. It is amazing the level of protests that are already occurring there, given the penalties that they are incurring with thousands of people in jail. You want my opinion on this? I don't know. I understand the historical context, but it's horrible, frankly. And no one wins. And every day it goes on, more people die and more infrastructure is destroyed. And for no reason. Because this can only end one way. But there's no serious effort to negotiate with Russia, at least not as of right now. And Ukraine has done nothing egregiously wrong against Russia. Even now, there's some kind of funny videos with Russian soldiers and Ukrainians, and again, these are the same people. It just doesn't make sense. It really, really doesn't. I am proud of the Ukrainians, their level of fighting. After this, they deserve their own sovereignty. They deserve their own foundation and revolution story. I hope they continue on this path. I hope NATO and Europe, even the UN, finds ways to help them, without putting boots on the ground, because that won't serve anyone's good. That's just more death and getting us closer to the brink, something we can't afford. We also can't afford to do nothing, and that's the problem. As I've reminded it in many, many videos, two wrongs don't make a right. And sometimes there are no good options. And that's where we're at here today. Really, to conclude, this is a very, very clear-cut thing. What's happened is wrong. I don't care on what level you analyze it. Morally, wrong. Religious, wrong. Militarily, it's been a blunder. Economically, it's already been disastrous. Geopolitically, it's not been good for Russia. It's made Russia approaching what you would define as a pariah. Even China has come out against it. And it's forced a certain unity in Europe we haven't seen in a long time. It's one of the few things that virtually the entire world agrees upon, and that's really remarkable. But it's clear-cut. There are plenty of political grievances going back on both sides, and events and things we can talk about that both have done wrong. But a full-scale invasion on European soil involving hundreds of thousands of troops, millions of civilians, for no reason. Let me be clear. Any reason that Putin has given is propaganda. It is a lie. There's no reason. Except maybe Ukraine wasn't doing 100% of what he wanted. That's not a sin. It's a sovereign nation. It has a right to do what it wants, right or wrong, whatever he thinks. This is hurting the Russian people immensely, and it's wasteful. That's what bugs me too, just on a material sense, is wasting so much in the way of resources and time at a time when we need to be rebuilding. It's not even helping Putin's cronies. It's not helping Putin. He could have retired or continued on even with many feathers in his cap, at least ones he could point to for Russia. But it's entirely possible in one fell swoop he's erased 2 decades of progress. This wasn't smart. This was actually very dumb. But that's what happens with dictators. That's what happens with success. That's what happens when you are so sure you're right and never listen to other people. You end up overreaching and falling down. You know, the story of Daedalus and Icarus comes to mind. It's okay to succeed. It's even good. But you can, and sometimes certain types of people do, overreach. And there shouldn't be any place for this type of war in the 21st century. We've done so much. It's unpopular in Russia, I can tell you that. It's not being lauded at all. Not at all. And there's a little bit of kind of the way things are going in Ukraine on the military front really reminds me of Finland. Yeah, everyone knew Finland would lose to Russia in 1939, 1940, but no one really understood just how much it was going to cost Russia to win. And that's kind of where we're at now, except now we're by the time with social media and posting and all this stuff. I don't have any answers. I don't know where this will go. What does worry me? Unintended consequences. It's spiraling out of control. I don't know. I just don't like death. I don't like wanton destruction. I'd rather be building and accomplishing, achieving, not this. Not loss for no reason. Again, the only positive I can say about it is the unification that the Ukrainians have shown. That's something. And to a lesser extent, the unification NATO has shown. And I really do get the criticism that they're not doing enough. I really do. But I just don't know what more could be done. I don't know. Maybe there's some genius solution, but I don't know. I'm tired. This has been on our minds a lot the last few days, and this is affecting real people. That's the thing people have to... I know people know that intellectually, but they have to realize emotionally, this isn't just a game. This is real lives. These are people that worked, saved up, have homes. They're losing it all. And through no fault of their own, or even their governments. So it doesn't matter what Biden may or may not have done or said, or if he's weak or strong. It doesn't matter if sanctions are too weak from Europe and all that. It has to stop. That's such just a clear-cut thing. But I don't know that Putin can back out, and if he does, his political future is over, like I said. But NATO absolutely cannot let him stay in there, because if they do, they'll collapse. Maybe a compromise would be, okay, Putin needs to step down one way or the other, softly or otherwise, and NATO essentially dissolves and turns into something new. I mean, there was a consideration to dissolve NATO in the 90s and replace it with more of a European defense. Maybe it's time. Maybe, NATO is an artifact of the Cold War. Maybe it's time for NATO to reform, just as the League of Nations turned into the United Nations. Maybe it's outlived its usefulness. We don't want a new Cold War. And we can't return to it. Don't know. It just feels like we can't catch a break. Seems like there's been something for the last 2 years, doesn't it? Not a moment's worth of peace. Just remember that this is affecting real people in real places. We can debate the morality and sophistry and politics of it later, but the shooting needs to stop. From there, we can debate the finer points, but people's lives need to stop being destroyed. And that's the kind of the end and the beginning of it. It's wrong, it's immoral. It's pretty much just evil. And that's objectively true. I don't... Anyone who could sit down and say that what Putin's doing is good, I don't really have much to say to you. I sure as shit wouldn't trust you. All the other points aside, this is wrong. For oh so many reasons. If we can't at least agree on that simple fact, next thing we'll be arguing if the sky's up. Why it's wrong, why it happened, who's to blame, then we can debate that all we want. But the fact that what's happening right now is wrong, that needs to just be something we accept as truth. Anyway, that's what it is. There's my statement on it. People have asked me. I knew Russia would come back into the international front years ago when people had written them off. And I had feelings about Putin when he took over, especially when he ended up staying in power longer than his term would have, explicitly allowed. But even I am incredibly shocked about this. Most people are. This is beyond the pale. Truly it is. Don't know. Hopefully it's over soon. Hopefully people we know are safe and alright. Hopefully something good can come from this after all of it. It's the best we can say. Hopefully we learn from our past mistakes. Both sides, East and West. This can't become the norm. This can't become how things are settled and done. Anyway, see, now this is why I like doing Star Trek videos. It's a lot less heavy. I'm going to call it a night, folks. This is Misha. Please feel free to comment. Just please be respectful. Again, people are suffering and dying. Please, please keep that in mind and don't be disrespectful to that. Again, these are people that I've studied, I've visited there, I've been to these places. This is very personal. For not just me, but a lot of people. Russians and Ukrainians alike. Because there's no difference. It's the same people. It's the same people. It's just wrong. It's fundamentally in the gut and the heart wrong for them to be killing each other. Anyway, I'll catch you very soon. Next time.